I am convinced that the solution to this epidemic is in this room. And it's a combination of law enforcement, public health, and good government policy that will turn the tide on the opioid crisis and will develop a system for dealing with addiction. Because if it's not heroin or fentanyl or carfentanil, it's going to be something else, folks. And this governor recognizes that. This governor recognizes that this isn't a moral failing. This is an epidemic that is reaching every single family. And that law enforcement is on the front lines and cannot solve this problem. They're doing their part. But this problem will be solved in the long term when we create a long-term treatment and recovery system. And that is going to take good government policy that will have good public health outcomes. And so our Governor, Charlie Baker, is not only a big guy who is really smart, but he has an enormous heart. And we are so lucky to have him leading the way in this country, in this state, on an epidemic that we will get a handle on, thanks in large part to his leadership. So, Charlie.
Thank you, Thank you. Kind of don't know where to go from there. That was quite an introduction. I wish my parents had heard it, because my dad would have liked it and my mom would have believed it. Well, first of all, I just want to welcome all of you to this conference, and to those of you from other parts of the country, welcome to the Commonwealth. I say all the time when I talk about this epidemic that this is not a we-they issue, this is an us issue. And I found that out as a candidate. When I would travel around the Commonwealth, it didn't matter what part of the Commonwealth I was in, somebody at some point would come up to me and tell me their story, and their stories broke my heart. And part of the reason I got into this issue was because of those stories, those intimate moments when somebody would literally stand around and wait for the event to end and the pictures to stop, and to have like a private chance. And it was always a private chance, and that had to do in some respects with the stigma associated with this issue before they would speak to me about what their personal hell was all about, and whether they were talking about their mom or their dad or their brother or their sister or their neighbor or their friend or their husband or their wife. The stories they told were compelling in part because they were fighting so hard, or had fought so hard, to try to save someone. And in most cases, the person ended up trapped in this terrible place because they had followed the directions of a trusted clinical advisor. And I think in some ways, for us as a Commonwealth, a big part of our approach to this has been, let's figure out how to change the game on the front end. Why is it that 80% of the world's opioids are consumed in a country that only represents 5% of the world's population? Why does a country with 320 million people write 250 million opioid prescriptions? Why is it that you can graduate, or you used to be able to graduate, from dental school, medical school, nursing school, and pharmacy school in Massachusetts without ever taking or passing a course in opioid therapy or pain management? That's no longer true. That was one of the things that we dealt with as part of our initial run at some of the prevention and education issues. But as I was hearing all these stories back in 2014, I did what people usually do. I'm a healthcare guy. I went and talked to a bunch of people I knew who worked in emergency rooms and said, I'm hearing this everywhere I go. Am I imagining this, or is this like a really big issue? And the people in the ER said, yeah, it's gigantic. And so how come no one's talking about it? Well, it's a tough issue to talk about. Well then, I'm going to start talking about it. And that led to the legislation that the chief talked about, which I think has helped elevate the conversation and to get other folks involved in the dialogue. And I remember where I was. I was given a speech on this issue at the Harvard Medical School. And the weather was nice, so it was probably the 1 week of the year we call summer around here. And somebody came up to me and said, "So the chief of police in Gloucester started this new program where if you show up at the police station and you say you want to seek treatment and you turn in your stuff, they'll help you find treatment. What do you think of that, Governor?" Sort of like, and I said, "Sounds like it's worth trying to me." I mean, the folks in law enforcement, they were seeing this stuff long before anybody else. They are, as John said, in many cases, the front line, and the people in many cases who are most familiar with people who are dealing with this issue in their communities. And afterwards, I had a bunch of people say to me, "You really think this is a good idea?" And I said, "I don't know. But what I do know is if we live by the same set of rules and standards and thoughts and observations and approaches that we've lived by before on this, we're not going to get anywhere. So yeah, let's see what happens." And the fact that you're all here today speaks to the fact that this was a courageous and out-of-the-box approach to creating yet another path to treatment for people who needed one. So God bless you all for being part of a community that's trying to think differently about how we deal with this problem and this epidemic. Because as the chief and as John said, there are families behind every single one of these people, and they, in many respects, suffer every bit as much as their family member does. Now here in the Commonwealth, we've added over 1,100 new beds in treatment capacity. We have created a far more aggressive approach to dealing with the prevention and education piece, whether you're talking about prescribers or you're talking about coaches or you're talking about school-based programs. There's a lot going on there. And we've increased dramatically the state's own spending on treatment and recovery programming. And after 15 years of negative trends, double-digit increases every year in prescriptions, overdoses, and deaths, 15 years in a row, every single year. For the first 9 months of 2017, for the first time in over 15 years, we've had a 10% reduction in deaths, a 30% reduction in prescriptions, and the number of overdoses has started to flatten out. Now, I've had a bunch of people say to me, "Is that an aberration?" Well, it better not be. But from my point of view, what it speaks to is the collaborative effort that people have made to treat this as a chronic illness, to be willing to think differently about different paths to treatment, and to stop thinking that this isn't an opportunity for everyone to play, has clearly bent the trend. I mean, if you have something that literally goes like this every single year in the wrong direction for 15 years, and all of a sudden it goes like that, something is happening. And I would argue that something that's happening here is a lot more work on the front end with prevention and education, but also a change in attitude on the part of a lot of players about trying to find paths to treatment for people, and a significant increase in our existing treatment capacity. Now, we also just filed new legislation to try to get at the aftercare piece of this. We don't have the kind of credentialing or standards in place around aftercare that we have in so many other areas where we have chronic disease and chronic illness. So we really want to create a structure around what it means to be a recovery coach, what it means to do the counseling that everybody agrees needs to be part of medication-assisted treatment, and try to establish some framework so that people can start to figure out, and families can start to figure out, what a successful aftercare program looks like and what might work for them and for their family member. When you think about diabetes or congestive heart failure or heart disease or coronary artery disease or a whole bunch of other chronic illnesses, we have standards and credentialing and structure in place and tons of data that then translates into what looks like best practice. So that providers and family members and patients have some idea of what that looks like. We haven't done that in the addiction space. And I'm glad that we're going to be doing it. But that first step, that path to treatment, for a lot of people, that step comes through a whole variety of different doors. And the fact that so many folks in law enforcement have stepped up and decided to become part of that process, to become one of those doors, one of those support organizations, one of those pathways to treatment for people, is an enormous statement by you about the value you place on the lives of those individuals and their families. And we should all be grateful that you, as key players and leaders and opinion makers in your communities, have helped us all change the nature of this conversation away from what John referred to as a character flaw, which it's not, and into a conversation about what it is, which is a brutal and difficult and horrible chronic illness that needs to be beaten back and supported with treatment and a recognition and an understanding that we all need to play if we're going to help people get better. Now, I think it's terrific that you're here sharing best practices, because from my point of view, this is also an area where we need to do more sharing of best practices, not less. Because when you talk about a lot of the issues around addiction, and especially around opioid addiction, we're still early in the game. And the more that you can do, and that we can do collectively, to figure out the sorts of approaches and interventions that work, and share that data more generally with one another, the more likely we are to be successful. The final point I'll just make, I talk about this issue a lot, so people come up and talk to me about it a lot. I was coming out of a courthouse about a year ago, and one of the court officers just chased me down on the street, and he just handed me this crumpled up piece of paper, and he said, I want you to read this. So I put it in my pocket, along with all the other crumpled up pieces of paper I got in that day. And I got home that night and I took it out and I started to read it. And it was a letter that his daughter had written about her brother, his son. And the letter talked about the fact that his son, her brother, had grown up in a great family, been a terrific athlete, good student, got injured, got overprescribed, and the very special hell that family had been through ever since. The letter went on to talk about, in excruciating detail, all the family and this young man had been through in their battle and their fight to save him. And it closed by saying, he's in recovery today. We don't know if he'll be in recovery tomorrow. But as long as he's in recovery, we have hope. We have hope that somehow we'll get through today, and then we'll get through tomorrow, and maybe we'll get through the day after that. And she talked about the fact that he found his way into treatment by accident. The right place at the right time with the right message from the right person. And she thanked God that that one particular special moment at that one point in time had happened. And I think about that all the time. What is it that at some point moves somebody into treatment? Or moves somebody back into treatment if they fail the first time? Or moves them back into treatment if they fail twice? You know, we grow up telling everybody that, failure is part of success. That it's okay to fail. The goal here is to try. Learn if you fail, try again. We say that all the time. But then when it comes to people dealing with treatment and addiction, we think failure is failure. It's not failure. It's a step back on the path to success. And the fact that so many of you represent that moment and that possibility and that opportunity for somebody that may be the time when it sticks. So that somebody ends up in recovery and every day battling to stay there is a wonderful thing. And I thank you all for getting way outside what most people would think of as your own comfort zone to help your friends and your neighbors. God bless.